The battlefield of the late 18th century was not merely a place of violence. It was a sensory assault that defied the modern imagination. Before the first shot was even fired, there was the sound. It was a specific, terrifying mechanical cadence that rose above the shouting of officers and the nervous shuffling of feet. It was the ringing of steel against steel. Thousands of heavy iron ramrods were being drawn from their loops, driven down the barrels of muskets, and returned to their housing in unison. To an opposing army, this metallic clatter was a signal of impending doom. It meant that the British line was formed, loaded, and waiting. It meant that the Redcoat machine had been switched on. To understand the dominance of the British Empire during this era, one must first look past the generals and the grand strategies, and focus on the singular instrument of its power, the infantry battalion. By the turn of the 19th century, the British Army had transformed itself from a loose collection of regiments into a standardized, industrialized factory of death. This transformation, often called the Redcoat Revolution, was not built on advanced technology, for the weapons of the day were crude and unreliable. It was built on a radical reimagining of human psychology and discipline. It turned the chaotic, smoky confusion of black powder warfare into a mathematical equation that only the British could solve. The tool at the center of this equation was the short-land pattern musket, affectionately and universally known as the Brown Bess. By modern standards, it was a clumsy beast. It weighed over 10 pounds, fired a massive .75 caliber lead ball, and operated on a flintlock mechanism that was prone to misfiring in damp weather. But its greatest flaw was its inaccuracy. The barrel was smoothbore, lacking the rifling grooves that spin a bullet for stability. Beyond 100 yards, hitting a man-sized target was more a matter of luck than skill. A soldier might aim at the enemy's chest and hit the man 3 files to the left, or miss entirely as the ball curved erratically through the air. In the hands of an individual, the Brown Bess was erratic, but the British military mind realized that war was not fought by individuals. It was fought by units. If one musket was inaccurate, 500 muskets fired simultaneously created a kill zone where accuracy became irrelevant. The air itself would become saturated with lead. The challenge, therefore, was not how to teach a soldier to shoot straight, but how to teach 500 men to act as a single organism. They had to load, present, and fire in perfect synchronization, regardless of the screaming of the wounded, the roar of enemy cannon, or the primal instinct to run away. This was the paradox of the era. The British soldier was often recruited from the lowest rungs of society, the desperate, the criminal, or the destitute. Yet, through a brutal and sophisticated system of conditioning, these men were forged into the most disciplined fighting force in Europe. They were taught to suppress their humanity and become components of a machine. This discipline was physical, enforced by the drill sergeant's cane and the officer's lash, but it was also psychological. It created a wall of redcoats that simply refused to break. However, this supremacy did not happen overnight. In the decades prior to the Napoleonic Wars, the British Army was a patchwork of inconsistent methods. A colonel in one regiment might drill his men to march at a certain pace, while a colonel in another regiment favoured a completely different step. There was no British way of war, only a collection of private fiefdoms. It took the disasters of the American Revolution and the looming threat of revolutionary France to force a change. It required a revolution in thinking, led by men who saw warfare as a science rather than an art. The stage was set for a total overhaul of military doctrine. The goal was to create a force where a commander could issue a single order and have it executed instantly by thousands of men, moving with the precision of clockwork. This is the story of how that machine was built, how it was maintained, and how it eventually crushed the greatest armies of the age on the fields of Spain and Belgium. It begins with the realization that in the fog of war, the only thing a soldier can trust is the ritual of the drill. For much of the 18th century, the British Army operated less like a national institution and more like a collection of private clubs. A regiment was the personal property of its colonel. a man who had likely purchased his commission and viewed the unit as an extension of his own ego. The training methods, or evolutions, were often dictated by the colonel's personal whims. One commander might favor a slow, stately march, reminiscent of the parade grounds of London. Another might prefer a rapid, aggressive pace suited for skirmishing. While the 1764 manual exercise existed as a guideline, it was frequently ignored or modified. The result was a tactical nightmare. When different regiments were thrown together in a brigade, they often couldn't move in unison. They spoke different tactical languages, leading to gaps in the line, collisions during maneuvers, and dangerous confusion in the face of the enemy. Into this chaotic landscape stepped a man who was the antithesis of the dashing, romantic hero. General David Dundas was a Scotsman, a dour and meticulous career soldier who had spent years studying the rigorous military systems of Prussia. Dundas looked at the British Army and saw a mess of improvisation. He believed that war was a science of movement, governed by unchangeable principles of geometry. In 1792, he published the work that would fundamentally alter the destiny of the British soldier, The Rules and Regulations for the Movements of His Majesty's Infantry. Dundas's book, which would soon become the Bible of the British officer, stripped away the flamboyance of the colonel-run regiments. It introduced a rigid system known as the 18 Manoeuvres. These were not suggestions. They were a script. Every movement a battalion could possibly make, from forming a column to march, to deploying into a line for battle, to wheeling to face a flank attack, was codified. Dundas was obsessed with the concept of the pivot, a specific point around which a line of troops would swing like a gate. His obsession was so profound that the soldiers, with their grim barracks humour, nicknamed him Old Pivot. But a book, no matter how brilliant, is useless without enforcement. The task of hammering these regulations into the army fell to the Duke of York, the king's second son, who became commander-in-chief in 1795. The Duke is often remembered unfairly in nursery rhymes, but in reality, he was a tireless reformer. He understood that for Dundas's system to work, the officers had to be as disciplined as the men. He began to purge the army of its worst excesses, cracking down on the corruption that allowed wealthy incompetents to buy command of regiments they had no business leading. Under the Duke's watchful eye, the 1792 regulations became law. The implementation of this system on the parade ground was brutal and repetitive. The new god of the army was uniformity. To ensure that every soldier took a step of exactly the same length, the non-commissioned officers were issued a new tool, the pace stick. This device, looking like a large pair of wooden compasses, was twirled along the ground by the drill sergeant to measure the precise distance of every stride. 30 inches, not 29, not 31, 30 inches. Day after day, month after month, the soldiers marched until the rhythm was burned into their muscle memory. The goal was to erase the individual. A battalion of 800 men had to move as a single block. If they were ordered to wheel right, the men on the inner flank had to take short, choppy steps, marking time, while the men on the outer flank had to stride out purposefully, all to keep the line perfectly straight as it turned. This was not merely for show. In battle, a straight line meant that every musket could fire without obstruction. A curved or broken line meant that men would be masking each other's fire, or worse, shooting their own comrades in the back. By the early 1800s, the reforms of Dundas and the Duke of York had taken root. The British Army had been homogenised. A regiment from the Highlands of Scotland could now be placed alongside a regiment from the slums of London, and they would respond to the same drum beats and the same verbal commands with identical precision. They had become interchangeable parts in a grand, lethal machine. But the true test of this machine was not how well it could march, but how well it could kill. The drill square was about to give way to the firing range, where the science of the volley would be perfected. If the marching drill was the skeleton of the British Army, the musket drill was its nervous system. The prevailing wisdom of continental Europe, particularly among the French commanders, favoured the shock of the column, a massive, deep formation designed to punch through enemy lines by sheer weight of numbers. Against this sledgehammer approach, the British deployed a razor blade, the two-deep line. While most nations arrayed their infantry in 3 ranks, To provide a sense of security and density, British commanders, most notably the future Duke of Wellington, trusted their men enough to thin the line. By stretching a battalion of 500 men into just 2 ranks, they maximised the frontage. Every single musket could be brought to bear. There were no wasted men in the rear, waiting for a comrade to fall before they could shoot. This formation, later immortalised as the Thin Red Line, relied entirely on volume of fire to survive. A British battalion in the field, often reduced by sickness and campaigning to around 500 or 600 effectives, acted as a singular battery. The standard they were held to was exacting. A trained redcoat was expected to fire 3 rounds per minute with ball ammunition. By contrast, the conscript armies of the continent, often poorly drilled and terrified, struggled to manage 2. It was a simple, brutal calculus. In a firefight lasting 10 minutes, a British line of 500 men would unleash 5,000 more bullets than an equivalent French force. That statistical advantage was usually the difference between victory and defeat. Achieving this rate of fire required a sequence of movements so ingrained that a soldier could perform them in his sleep or in the blinding terror of combat. The process began with the command to handle the cartridge. The soldier would reach into his leather pouch and withdraw a paper tube containing pre-measured gunpowder and a heavy lead ball. He would bring it to his mouth and bite off the end, a requirement that meant men with poor opposing teeth were often rejected from service. The salty, sulphurous taste of black powder was the constant flavour of their existence. Next came the priming, shaking a small amount of powder into the pan, snapping the frizzen shut, and then the main charge. The rest of the powder and the ball were poured down the barrel. Then came the ramrod. The soldier had to draw the steel rod, drive the charge home with force, and, crucially, return the rod to its loops. In the heat of battle, panicked men often forgot to remove the ramrod, firing the metal spike toward the enemy and leaving themselves with a useless weapon. But the British drill was designed to override panic. It was a rhythm: bite, pour, ram, return. When the order came to make ready, hundreds of hammers clicked back. At present, the long wall of muskets levelled out, parallel to the ground. There was no command to aim in the modern sense. The Brown Bess was not a precision instrument. It was a shotgun for crowds. The soldiers simply levelled their weapons at the enemy's belt buckles and waited. When the command, fire, was given, the result was not just a noise, but a physical blow. The recoil of the .75 caliber weapon was severe, bruising shoulders black and blue after only a few volleys. However, the true genius of the British system was not always the mass volley, where everyone fired at once, leaving the battalion unloaded and vulnerable. Instead, they perfected platoon firing. The battalion was divided into subunits, or platoons. The firing would ripple down the line in a rolling cadence. As the platoon on the far left fired, the next one was presenting, and the one after that was making ready. By the time the ripple reached the right flank, the men on the left were reloaded and ready to begin again. To the enemy facing this, there was no respite. There was no moment of silence where they could gather their wits or launch a countercharge. There was only a ceaseless rolling storm of lead, a sheet of fire that moved back and forth across the British front. The psychological impact was devastating. The enemy was not fighting men. They were fighting a machine that breathed fire and smoke, a machine that did not stop until it was ordered to do so. As the battle wore on, the sensory environment degraded rapidly. Black powder produces thick, white smoke that clings to the ground. After 2 or 3 volleys, the fog of war became literal. Visibility dropped to mere yards. Soldiers could no longer see the enemy they were killing, nor the officers commanding them. They stood in a white void, eyes stinging, ears ringing, relying entirely on the tactile sensation of their neighbour's shoulder against theirs, and the rhythmic drumbeat of the loading drill to keep them alive. While the rolling volley was the primary method of destruction, the British military mind understood that firepower alone rarely swept a field. The volley was designed to shatter the enemy's cohesion, to turn a disciplined formation into a confused mob. Once that chaos was achieved, the machine shifted gears. The Redcoat Revolution was not just about the projection of lead. It was about the psychological projection of terror embodied in 17 inches of cold steel. The socket bayonet was a deceptively simple innovation. Unlike the plug bayonets of the previous century, which were jammed into the barrel and prevented the weapon from firing, the socket bayonet fit over the muzzle. This allowed the soldier to shoot, reload, and fire again with the blade fixed. It transformed the musket from a firearm into a 7-foot pike. The blade itself was triangular in cross-section, a design chosen for its brutal efficiency. A triangular puncture wound was difficult to stitch and slow to heal, prone to infection and causing catastrophic internal bleeding. It was a weapon designed to kill, but its true purpose was to intimidate. Contrary to popular cinema, extended hand-to-hand melees were rare. The bayonet charge was a game of psychological chicken. After the volleys had done their grim work and the enemy line began to waver, the British officers would lower their swords. The drums would change their beat. The command, "Charge bayonets," would ring out, followed by a collective, guttural roar from the men. The distinctive British, "Hurrah!" The sight of 1,000 men emerging from the smoke, moving at a trot with levelled steel, was usually enough to break the nerve of an already shaken opponent. Most enemy units would turn and run before the two lines ever collided. The Redcoats captured positions not by stabbing, but by convincing the enemy that staying meant certain death. But the true test of the British system's discipline came not when they were attacking, but when they were being hunted. The battlefield was the domain of the cavalry, and to an infantryman, the heavy cavalryman on a charging horse was a nightmare made flesh. A galloping horse is a heavy projectile, and a saber-wielding rider has the height and speed advantage. Against scattered infantry, cavalry was a slaughtering force. To survive, the Redcoats had to rely on geometry. They had to form the square. This maneuver was the ultimate examination of Dundas's drill manual. In the midst of battle, often while under cannon fire, a battalion in line had to fold in on itself to form a hollow box, 4 ranks deep. The front ranks would kneel, bracing the butts of their muskets against the ground, sloping their bayonets outward to create a hedge of steel points that no horse would voluntarily charge into. The rear ranks stood standing, ready to fire over the heads of their kneeling comrades. The discipline required to execute this was immense. Men had to ignore the terrifying thunder of hooves shaking the ground beneath their feet. They had to suppress the urge to run, which would be fatal as cavalry feasted on runners. Inside the square, the officers and drummers were protected, but the men on the perimeter were exposed to the world. They had to stand like statues. A single man flinching, a single gap opening in the wall of bayonets allowed the horses to penetrate, and the square would be cut to pieces from the inside out. Yet, time and again, the British square held. It became a fortress of red brick on the green fields of Europe. The soldiers were trained to hold their fire until the last possible second, often until they could see the whites of the horses' eyes. Firing too early meant empty muskets when the horses arrived. Firing at the right moment created a rampart of dead animals and fallen riders that blocked the path of those behind. This defensive mastery turned the infantry battalion into an island of invulnerability. It allowed the British to operate in open country, defying the traditional superiority of the cavalry. The soldier knew that as long as he stood his ground, kept his spacing, and trusted the man to his left and right, the beast could not touch him. The machine was not just a weapon, it was a shield. While General Dundas and the Duke of York were perfecting the rigid geometry of the line, a different kind of revolution was brewing on the cliffs of Kent. The Redcoat machine was devastating in a pitched battle on open ground, but the nature of war was changing. The French revolutionary armies, lacking the discipline for rigid lines, had unleashed swarms of skirmishers, tirailleurs, who fought in loose order. These men used cover, fired independently, and targeted officers and sergeants, picking apart the rigid British lines from a distance before the main columns even arrived. The British Army, designed to move as a single block, found itself stung and harassed by these invisible enemies. It became clear that to defeat the French, the British needed more than just automatons. They needed soldiers who could think. The answer came from Sir John Moore, a commander who possessed a radical philosophy for his time. Moore believed that the British soldier was capable of more than just blind obedience to the lash. In 1803, at Shorncliffe Camp, he began an experiment that would give birth to the modern concept of light infantry. Moore's training focused on speed, initiative, and intelligence. He wanted men who could move fast, use the terrain to their advantage, and operate in pairs or small groups without the direct oversight of an officer. At Shorncliffe, the flogging triangle was used sparingly. Instead, Moore fostered a sense of regimental pride and mutual respect between officers and men. He was building a scalpel to complement Dundas's sledgehammer. At the forefront of this new doctrine was a unit that would become legendary, the Experimental Rifle Corps, later the 95th Rifles. To distinguish them from the line infantry, they were stripped of the iconic red coat. In its place, they wore a dark bottle green uniform, designed to blend into the foliage of the woods and hedgerows. They were the first true camouflage soldiers, but their distinct appearance was merely the housing for their most lethal asset, the Baker rifle. If the Brown Bess was a clumsy club, the Baker was a surgeon's instrument. Shorter and heavier than the musket, its barrel was cut with 7 rectangular grooves, rifling, that gripped the lead ball and spun it as it left the muzzle. This spin provided gyroscopic stability, flattening the trajectory and drastically increasing accuracy. A good rifleman with a Baker could hit a man's head at 200 yards, a feat that was physically impossible with a smoothbore musket. However, this precision came at a cost. The ball had to be wrapped in a greased leather patch and forced down the tight rifled barrel with a mallet and significant effort. A rifleman took twice as long to reload as a redcoat with a musket. Because of this slow rate of fire, the riflemen could not stand in the open line. They had to fight differently. They fought in extended order, scattering in pairs across the rough ground ahead of the main army. One man would fire while his partner kept watch, ensuring they were never both unloaded at the same time. They targeted the enemy's command structure, deliberately sniping officers, drummers, and artillery crews. This was considered unsporting by the old guard, but it was devastatingly effective. The culture of the rifles was distinct. While the line infantryman was drilled to suppress his individuality, the rifleman was encouraged to use his. He was taught to judge distance, to account for wind, and to make tactical decisions on his own. The officers of the 95th did not carry heavy spontoons or canes to beat their men into line. They carried whistles to signal commands over the noise of battle. They often dined with their men and led from the front, not as aristocratic overseers, but as fellow professionals. The combination of Moore's light infantry doctrine and the precision of the Baker rifle gave the British Army a unique flexibility. As the Peninsular War loomed, the French would find that before they could ever reach the thin red line, they had to pass through a deadly screen of green jackets. These skirmishers would bleed the French columns white, disrupting their momentum and killing their leaders, ensuring that by the time the main heavy infantry clash occurred, the enemy was already half defeated. The machine had acquired a brain. The theories of Dundas, the discipline of the Duke of York, and the innovation of Moore were merely academic concepts until they were dragged into the dust and heat of the Iberian Peninsula. It was here, in the rocky hills of Portugal and the sun-baked plains of Spain, that the Redcoat Revolution would face its ultimate trial. The opposing force was the Imperial French Army, a juggernaut that had conquered Europe. They were veterans, energized by revolutionary zeal and led by marshals of immense skill. They were accustomed to seeing opposing armies break and run before the battle had even truly begun. But when they marched south to drive the British into the sea, they found a very different kind of enemy waiting for them. Commanding the British forces was Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington. He was a man of cold, pragmatic intellect who understood exactly what weapon he held in his hand. He knew that the British army was small, expensive, and difficult to replace. He could not afford the butcher's bill of a chaotic slugging match. Instead, he utilized the landscape itself to maximize the lethality of his drill system. Wellington perfected the tactic of the reverse slope. In battle after battle, at Talavera, Busaco, and Salamanca, Wellington would position his main infantry lines on the backside of a ridge, hidden from the enemy's view. This served two vital purposes. First, It protected his men from the terrifying efficiency of the French artillery. Cannonballs that would have ploughed through ranks of men simply buried themselves harmlessly in the earth of the hill. Second, it created a trap of devastating surprise. The French attack relied on the column of division. They would advance in massive, dense blocks of men, thousands strong, marching to the beat of drums and the chanting of Vive l'Empereur. The column was designed to terrify. It was a psychological battering ram. Usually the sight of this unstoppable human wave, combined with the clouds of skirmishers stinging the front, caused the enemy line to waver and break. The French would march up the hill, expecting to see the backs of fleeing British soldiers. Instead, as the French columns crested the ridge, winded from the climb and disorganized by the terrain, they were met with a sudden, shocking silence. A single command would ring out, and seemingly from the earth itself, a long, perfect line of redcoats would stand up. The distance was often no more than 50 yards. The psychological impact was reversed. The hunters became the prey. Here, the geometry of war asserted its dominance. A French column of 3,000 men might be 50 ranks deep, but only the first 2 ranks could fire their weapons. The other 2,900 men were useless spectators, blocked by their own comrades. Opposing them was a British line of perhaps only 1,500 men, but deployed 2 deep. Every single British musket could fire. The result was a mathematical slaughter. The British line would unleash a volley that hit the head of the French column like a physical hammer. The front ranks of the French would simply vanish, torn apart by hundreds of heavy lead balls. The column would stall, the men behind stumbling over the dead and dying in front of them. Before they could recover, the rolling fire of the platoons would begin. The flanks of the French column were enveloped in fire. They could not deploy into a line to return fire because the ground was too rough and the pressure too intense. They were trapped in their own mass, a dense target that the British could not miss. At the Battle of Busaco in 1810, this scenario played out with gruesome predictability. The French General Regnier's corps stormed the ridge, convinced they had the advantage. They were met by the 88th Connaught Rangers and the 45th Regiment. The British volleys shattered the columns in minutes. When the order to charge bayonets was given, the French, the masters of Europe, broke and fled down the bloody slopes. It was the triumph of system over fervour. The French relied on the impulse of the attack. The British relied on the discipline of the defence. The redcoat machine did not need to be passionate. It simply needed to be steady. It turned the hills of Spain into an anvil, upon which the French army was slowly, methodically hammered to pieces. By June of 1815, the redcoat machine had been perfected. The awkward recruits of the previous century had been replaced by a generation of hardened veterans who had marched from Lisbon to Toulouse. But the final examination of their discipline would not take place in the arid mountains of Spain. It would happen on a sodden, rain-lashed ridge in Belgium, near a village called Waterloo. Here, the system built by Dundas and the Duke of York would face the ultimate incarnation of French military might, Napoleon Bonaparte himself. The battlefield of Waterloo was a nightmare of mud. A torrential storm the night before had turned the rye fields into a quagmire, making movement difficult and soaking the soldiers to the bone. For hours, the British infantry did what they did best. They waited. To be a British soldier was to endure. They stood in their squares and lines, subjected to a terrifying bombardment from the French Grand Battery. Cannonballs ploughed through the mud, smashing through files of men. The discipline required to stand still while a comrade next to you was obliterated was the darkest fruit of their training. The sergeants, ever the backbone of the line, would simply close the ranks. "Close up, men! Steady!" was the mantra. The line had to remain unbroken. As the afternoon wore on, the French launched one of the greatest cavalry assaults in history. Marshal Ney sent thousands of cuirassiers and lancers, steel-clad horsemen who had ridden down armies across Europe, thundering up the slope. In any other era, this would have been the end. But the British infantry did not run. They shifted into the geometry of survival. The battalions folded into checkerboard squares, transforming the ridge into a grid of red fortresses. Inside the squares, the air was hot and acrid. The men stood 4 ranks deep, the front ranks kneeling with bayonets grounded, the rear ranks firing over their heads. The noise was deafening, the screaming of horses, the clash of sabres against musket barrels, and the rhythmic crash of volleys. The French cavalry flowed around the squares like water around rocks, but they could not penetrate them. The horses, terrified by the wall of bayonets, refused to charge home. The Redcoats, blackened with powder and exhausted, acted not as individuals, but as a single prickly organism. They reloaded, rammed and fired, repelling wave after wave until the pride of the French cavalry lay in ruin on the muddy slopes. But the supreme test was yet to come. As the sun began to set, Napoleon played his final card. He committed the Imperial Guard. These were the immortals, the giants of the French army, men who had never been defeated. They marched up the ridge in 2 massive columns, stepping over the bodies of their fallen comrades, the drums beating the pas de charge. The psychological weight of their advance usually caused enemies to flee before a shot was fired. They expected the battered British line to crumble. Waiting for them, lying flat in the tall corn to avoid artillery fire, was the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards. They were the elite of the British system, the embodiment of drill and discipline. As the bearskin caps of the French Guard crested the ridge, the voice of the Duke of Wellington rang out, "Now, Maitland, now's your time." In unison, the British Guardsmen stood up. The effect was electric. One moment the ridge appeared empty. The next, a solid wall of red blocked the French path. The Imperial Guard, stunned by this sudden apparition, hesitated. In that split second of hesitation, the British muskets levelled. The command, "Fire," unleashed a volley of devastating concentration. 300 Frenchmen fell in the first seconds. The British did not stop. They reloaded with the mechanical speed ingrained by years of practice. Another volley, and another. The French column, struck by a wall of lead, shuddered. They tried to deploy into a line to return fire, but the relentless British rhythm gave them no time. The great column began to sway. Then, the unthinkable happened. A cry went up from the French ranks, a sound that signaled the end of an era. La garde recule. The guard recoils. The invincible veterans of Austerlitz and Jena were falling back. The sight of the Imperial Guard retreating shattered the morale of the entire French army. The machine had broken the master. As the smoke finally drifted away from the ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, drifting over the tens of thousands of bodies that littered the wet ground, a profound silence settled over Europe. It was a silence that would last, largely uninterrupted, for nearly 40 years. The defeat of Napoleon at Waterloo was not merely a victory for the Duke of Wellington. It was the ultimate vindication of the British military system. The drill manuals of David Dundas, the relentless inspections of the Duke of York, and the harsh, repetitive discipline of the parade ground had been vindicated in the most brutal crucible imaginable. The Redcoat Revolution was complete. The army that had once been dismissed as a collection of drunks and criminals was now the undisputed master of the battlefield. In the years that followed, this machine became the police force of a burgeoning global empire. From the dusty plains of India to the rocky outposts of the Cape Colony, the sight of a single battalion of British infantry, marching in perfect cadence, was often enough to quell dissent. The reputation forged in Spain and Belgium did the work before a shot was fired. Potential enemies knew that to engage the British was to engage a force that did not break, a force that delivered death with the rhythmic inevitability of a factory line. The thin red line became more than a tactical formation. It became a psychological barrier that guarded the Pax Britannica. However, there was a tragic irony in this success. The system worked so well at Waterloo that it froze the British Army in time. For decades after 1815, the generals refused to change a single button on a tunic or a single sentence in the drill book. They believed they had achieved perfection. The Brown Bess musket, already obsolete by the time of Waterloo, remained the standard issue weapon until the late 1830s. The rigid lines and squares, designed to fight the French columns, were dogmatically applied to every conflict, regardless of the terrain or the enemy. The British Army became a prisoner of its own glory, sleeping under the long shadow of the Duke of Wellington until the rude awakening of the Crimean War revealed that technology was finally outpacing the drill sergeant. But looking back at the Redcoat era, one must look past the stagnation that followed and marvel at the achievement itself. In an age of crude weaponry, where the mechanisms of war were unreliable and chaotic, the British turned the soldier himself into the precision instrument. They took the chaos of black powder warfare, the blinding smoke, the deafening noise, the terrifying lethality, and imposed upon it a strict geometric order. They realized that while they could not control the bullet once it left the barrel, they could control the man who fired it. The true hero of this story was not the general on the horse, peering through his telescope. It was the private soldier. It was the man recruited from the alehouses and the jails, the man Wellington infamously called the scum of the earth. It was this man who was stripped of his individuality, beaten into shape by the pace stick, and drilled until he was an automaton. Yet, it was this same man who stood in the square at Waterloo, watching the cuirassiers charge, and decided not to run. It was the common soldier who internalized the discipline until it became a form of courage. The Redcoat Revolution was not a revolution of technology, but of the mind. It transformed the grim business of killing into a collective effort, a terrifying display of unity and resolve. It proved that a group of men, bound together by a shared code of movement and a shared rhythm of action, could withstand anything the world threw at them. The echoes of their drums have long since faded, and the flash of their red coats has vanished from the hills of Europe, but the legacy of their discipline remains. They were the machine that built an empire, one volley at a time. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this history as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.